Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Great to see all of you. Welcome to lesson number 6. And you have made it all the way to the grand finale. And what a grand finale it is. Very, very excited about this particular lesson. Really, really an incredible topic. Perhaps at the same time, incredibly fascinating, and I think incredibly misunderstood. So just to quickly review, we set out 6 weeks ago, or I think in this case it was 7 weeks ago, because we took a little break for Purim. Hope you all had a wonderful Purim. We certainly had a beautiful Purim here at Chabad of Northridge. Thankfully, we did not schedule our class for last Wednesday because this place was overrun with Jewish men, women, and children during Purim, and we needed a little bit of time to put things back together. We had a good 400 or 500 people here over Purim. Baruch Hashem. So thank you for staying with us for one more week for lesson number 6. So we set out 7 weeks ago to embark on a 6-week journey to explore 3,300 years of Jewish scholarship, 130,000 published books that exist, besides the many, sadly, tragically, that have been lost. Laura, grab yourself a copies or a book. Okay, good. 3,300 years of Jewish scholarship, Jewish literature, 130,000 books. We broke it down into 7 genres, 7 categories. Why do I say 7? Because we went through lesson number 1. We talked about the Tanach, the written Torah, the 24 books of the Torah. Lesson 2, who remembers? Midrash. We talked about Midrash, how the sages expand the written word, expound upon and elaborate upon the written word, whether it's in the spiritual, in the ethical, in the practical, in the halachic. That was lesson 2. Lesson 3 was the Talmud. We swam through the incredible ocean known as the Talmud, and that brought us all the way up to the year 500 of the Common Era. We continued in lesson 4 with Halachah, Jewish law, the incredible world of Jewish law as it continues to expand today, as the world evolves and progresses and changes. Judaism has an incredible system that keeps up seamlessly all of the changes in the world and in Judaism. And then finally, lesson 5, we covered 2 topics that are related to each other. We covered Chakira, Jewish philosophy, and Musar, Jewish ethics and character development. And that brought us to lesson 6, where again we have, it's really one topic, Kabbalah and Chassidus. Okay, so that is our discussion for this evening. When I say the word Kabbalah, what comes to mind, friends, when you hear that word? Mysticism. Mysticism. What else? Numbers. You said numbers? Numbers. Very good. There's a lot of numbers in Kabbalah. Numerology. The Zohar, the basic book of Kabbalah. Okay, good. Good. The Kabbalah Center. Very good. Very good. Excellent. You see, this is fun. Yes.
Formed with studying spirituality through Judaism.
Okay, so Kabbalah.
Madonna and some
okay, so we think about Madonna and some of these movie stars who are studying Kabbalah and sort of how that fits in. Okay, great. Wow, this is fun. So we went from Zohar 2,000 years ago, mysticism 4,000 years ago, or even 5,000 years ago, to all the way to Madonna. So we're really going through the entirety of existence. Okay, is she still around? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, fine. Forgive me, I'm not a big fan. So, sorry, I apologize. I'm from the 70s, so anyway, fine, very good. Kabbalah. Who comes to mind when we say the word Kabbalah, besides Madonna, of course? Who comes to mind when we say the word Kabbalah? Who are some of the famous teachers, masters, authors of Kabbalah? Yes? The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidus. Anybody else? Luria, the Arizal. Maimonides. Interesting, you say Maimonides in Kabbalah. Many people don't associate Maimonides with Kabbalah. There's a whole discussion whether Maimonides had access to the Zohar or not. But Maimonides definitely talks about the mystical teachings of Judaism. Okay, anybody else? Any other names of famous names of Kabbalah? Anybody remember the name of the author of the Zohar? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous rabbi buried in Meron, the person whose Yartzeit, whose day of passing is marked on Lag BaOmer, very, very famous rabbi, and many, many others. When I say the word Kabbalah, I think of a very famous joke, one of my favorites. Now, I haven't told this one in a while, so I'm probably 15 years older than when I last told it, so if I mess it up, you'll have to bear with me. As I said before, I'm from the 70s, okay? So, they tell a joke. There is a Jewish immigrant, a Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant by the name of Moshe. Moshe has lived in this country for many decades, and he's never received his U.S. citizenship. The reason being because he's heard that there's this very, very difficult test that you're put through an interview with a judge, and they ask you questions, basics of American history, and he doesn't speak English. So he's very concerned. How am I going to sit through this? And he's talking to a friend of his, and his friend says, "No, who are you voting for?" And he says, "I'm not voting. I'm not a citizen." He says, "What? You've lived here for 30 years." He says, "Yeah, but I don't speak English." He says, "Listen, it's very, very simple. I know tons of people who have gone. There's this and this judge. You sign up for his court. He always asks the same 5 questions in the same order. Just memorize the answers. Okay? Just memorize. Just answer the following 5 answers. His first question always is, what is your name? What is your name? So you tell him Moshe. Very simple, Moshe. Second question always is, who was the first president of the United States? So you tell him George Washington. Third question always is, how many states are there in these blessed United States? You tell him 50. Very good. Fourth question always is, how many children do you have, Moshe? And the answer always is, thank God, 7. All right. 7. He had 7 children. Moshe has 7 children. Fifth question always is, are your parents alive? And again, here you thank God again, you say, thank God both. Thank God both. Very, very simple. Memorize this. It doesn't matter what he says. Just answer the following 5 answers. Moshe, George Washington, 50, 7. Thank God both. Very, very simple. Comes before the judge. Judge looks over and says to him, "Sir, I have some questions for you." Nods his head. Who was the first president of the United States? Moshe. Okay. And what is your name? George Washington. Okay, this is an interesting interview. How many children do you have, George Washington? 50. Then he says, how many states in the United States? He says 7. And then finally the judge looks at him and says, "Sir, one of us is insane. Is it you or me?" And he says, "Thank God both." Beautiful. Wow, I got it right. Okay. Not too bad for a man from the 70s. All right. So why do I think of this when I hear the word Kabbalah? Because as a Chabad rabbi, and you're going to learn as we get into the history, and we'll do a lot of history tonight because it's a fascinating history. And I think it's an often misunderstood history. As a Chabad rabbi, we teach Hasidic teachings, which are based on the teachings of Kabbalah. And one of the reasons why I feel very passionate about these teachings is because they enable people to not just do Judaism and to not just speak Judaism, as in do the rituals, speak the prayers, but to really understand what it is they're saying, besides the literal meaning of what they're saying, but to really appreciate the depth and the spirituality and the energy that lies within every Jewish prayer, within every word of the Torah, within every mitzvah that we do. There's tremendous energy, spirituality, as is revealed and elucidated through the teachings of Kabbalah and the Hasidic teachings. And that is really a very, very beautiful experience. That's something very, very special. Unlike our friend Moshe, who had no idea what the fellow was saying. He was repeating by rote the answers to questions. That's the way many Jews, unfortunately, do Judaism. Many Jews do Judaism by rote. This is what I was taught. I say the blessings. I come to, I do Hanukkah. I do Latkes. I do Hamantashen. And again, beautiful. It's all good. But where's the depth? Where's the energy? Where's the passion? Where's the spirituality that comes from the teachings of Kabbalah and Chassidus? Something is squeaking. If someone has maybe hearing aids that are squeaking. All right, it stopped. Look at that. Amazing. All right. Sometimes you just have to. All right, whatever it is. Sometimes you just have to acknowledge the existence of something and it takes care of itself.
I'm kidding.
No? All right. Okay. All right. Very good. I think when it gets quiet, it stops and then it starts up again. Anyway, let's continue, friends. Let's continue. All right. So let's get right into it. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on history, on really trying to understand what these things are and what they're not. And then we'll spend a little bit of time towards the end in a very beautiful, meaningful fashion. We will actually study some Kabbalah and Chassidus. Okay, so let's get started. What does the word Kabbalah actually mean? The Hebrew word, what's the meaning of the Hebrew word Kabbalah, friends? Anybody? Oh, does it? Okay, so no. So what does it say in the book? That which is received. Very good. You see, some people always cheat. They look in the book. Very good. We're on page 234, figure 6.1. Kabbalah is that which is received. Now, the question is like this. Is that unique to Kabbalah? Do you remember how many times I mentioned to you that we believe as Jews that the Torah was received by Moses at Mount Sinai? In fact, there's a very famous statement, the beginning of Pirkei Avot, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moses received the Torah at Sinai. What do we celebrate on Shavuot? In Hebrew, what is the term? Kabbalat HaTorah, the receiving of the Torah. So it's not just Kabbalah, it's not just the mystical teachings, it's the entire Torah, right? What is unique about Kabbalah that we call it Kabbalah? And so the answer is yes. So much of Judaism was received. By the way, on the subject of received, you may recall when we talked about the oral tradition, which makes up the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, etc., we talked about how most of the oral tradition is in the category of received. And then we had two others that are derived and legislated, as you may recall from so many weeks ago when we discussed this. The point being that yes, all of Torah is received, but all of Torah is received and transmitted in a way that the greatest number of people should receive, learn, and comprehend. That was the goal. And so when they transmitted Midrash or Mishnah or Talmud or Halachah or Musar or Hakira, any of these subjects that we've discussed until now, the goal was get it to as many people as possible, get it out to the masses. The scholars will study it at their level, the simple people will study it at their level, men, women, children, everyone should study the Kabbalah, everyone from all backgrounds, from all levels, everyone should study Torah. That was the goal. When it comes to Kabbalah, it's a very different philosophy. When it comes to Kabbalah, we have to add one more word, also in your books on page 234, and that is the word sod. What does sod mean? Sod means secret. Received in secret. Things that were received from Sinai and from before Sinai, as we're going to see when we talk about books of Kabbalah, but they were deliberately given to a very select group of people. They were not exposed. They were not given to the masses. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the reason. And that is the big difference between Kabbalah and the rest of the Torah, that initially it was not revealed to the masses. Okay? Let's see a beautiful quote here, incredible text here from Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed, where he talks about these hidden teachings of the Torah. The English is on page 235. As you are well aware, even the Talmud, which was received by tradition, was not originally committed to writing in a book that was disseminated to the people. Right? Maimonides is telling us, recall in the history of the Torah, Initially, the oral tradition was oral. It was not committed to writing. And whatever was committed to writing initially was very sparingly. They were not very comfortable with writing everything down. They wrote as necessary, as needed for the urgent circumstances of the time. Continue inside. Now, if care was taken to avoid writing the oral Torah in a book accessible to all, because of the disadvantages in such a system, certainly then no portion of the esoteric teachings of Torah could be written, which would divulge these teachings to everyone. Okay? So if we were careful with what we write in the regular aspects of Torah, in Halachah, in Jewish law, in regular tradition, how much more so when it comes to the esoteric teachings. Rather, Maimonides continues, these teachings were orally communicated by a few uniquely qualified individuals to other uniquely qualified individuals. As I earlier explained the saying, he's quoting now from the Talmud, the secrets of the Torah can only be entrusted to skilled sages. Nothing but a few remarks and allusions to these teachings are to be found in the Talmud and Midrashim. They are like small kernels enveloped in many husks, so that the reader is generally occupied with the husk without thinking that it encloses a kernel. Wow. Okay, so the Kabbalistic teachings, which include deep spiritual, mystical explanations of the nature of God, the makeup of the divine revelation, the nature of the human soul, the nature of animal souls, the spiritual energies that are created and that are and that explode in the world when a person does a good deed or when a person does the opposite of a good deed. Okay, all of that spirituality was considered too lofty to just make available to the masses, too lofty, too powerful to just make available to the masses. And so as Maimonides puts it, in a general sense, it was conveyed from skilled sages to skilled sages, and only little hints of it are found throughout the Talmud and the Midrash. Okay, so that is the first point that we make over here, that it is transmitted in a secret fashion. Now the question is why? Why? What are we so concerned about? Why was Kabbalah transmitted in such a secretive fashion? What do you think, friends? What were they afraid of? What is the concern? Yes.
The story before Torah scholars went into the garden, and only one of them came out. Totally
Okay.
Everybody else.
So what does that story teach us, Irving?
It's very dangerous.
It's dangerous. Okay. It can be dangerous. It can be dangerous because it can be misunderstood, it can be misconstrued, it can be taken in the wrong way. Okay. Anything else? It's actually our next text, okay. So we'll get to it.
It can be dark.
It can be dark. What do you mean it can be dark?
Well, I mean, it talks about everything.
Okay, so why is that dark? What do you mean by dark?
Because
secretive?
well, yeah, like it talks about ascension, really, and transcension.
Okay.
And it talks about death and life and incarnation.
Okay, so if I understand what you're saying, perhaps is that because it delves into some very, very sensitive and powerful topics, it can perhaps not just be misunderstood, which is what Irving mentioned, but maybe it could actually be misused.
Yeah.
It could be misused by charlatans, by charismatic individuals who are looking to mislead others, meaning it's very hard to mislead someone when you lecture about the laws of a mezuzah. Maybe you'll convince them to put the mezuzah upside down. But when you talk about esoteric teachings that are written cryptically, that the average person without commentary doesn't understand, you can lead people along into perhaps a very unhealthy place. Anything else?
Even despite all those things, shouldn't we still read it? So
we're gonna talk about that. We'll talk about that. Okay. So let's elaborate upon these 2 points, that it can be misunderstood and it can be misused. Okay. Misunderstood. Let's talk about the story that Irving alluded to. Let's look a story in the Talmud. This is text number 2 on page 236. The Talmud tells the famous story. These were 4 sages, 4 colleagues. They all lived at the same time. This is 1st century of the Common Era. shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, 4 sages entered the orchard. Let's just explain what the orchard means. The orchard here doesn't mean that they went into a place where there's oranges at CSUN. The orchard in Hebrew is Pardes. Pardes is an acronym for Pshat, Remez, Drush, Soid, the 4 dimensions through which the Torah can be interpreted: the simple meaning, the illusory meaning, the character teachings of Torah, and the mystical teachings, the Soid of Torah. So when it says they entered into the orchard, it means they went beyond what most people study in Judaism, and they delved deeply into the mystical teachings. Okay, so these 4 rabbis decided to go on a mystical journey of really completely being enveloped and immersed in the mystical teachings of Judaism. What happened to them? First of all, we're introduced to these 4 rabbis. Ben Azai, great sage. Ben Zoma, both of these great sages are quoted in the Mishnah. Acher, who we're going to see soon is not his real name. Acher means the other. And Rabbi Akiva. Most of you have heard of Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest rabbis who is really responsible for Judaism as we have it today. I actually spoke about his story in the class that we gave about the Talmud, so you can go back and refer to that. Okay, what happened to these 4 rabbis? Ben Azai looked and died. Ben Azai died. What happened to him? His soul, as the commentaries explain, his soul experienced like an overload of spirituality, and it was separated from his body. His soul experienced an ascension beyond the physical, and he expired. He died. Okay, sort of like an overload of electricity that will completely fry a small appliance. I remember when I was in yeshiva in London. I was going off to London in 1993, and my first time going overseas, and I heard this thing, there's 110, 220, you have to get your appliances. So I go to the local drugstore, and I look for a converter. One of them was $20, one of them was $3. Of course, I got the one that was $3, and I brought my little music player, remember, with the double cassettes, so you can copy and make your own mix. It was really, really cool. And I come to the yeshiva and I plug it into the $3 converter, and boom, it goes up in smoke. Okay, it expired. It separated from its soul. It was an overload. That's what happened to Ben Azai. Okay, he had a spiritual overload and he died. By the way, we find this in one of the stories in the Torah. Something similar happened. You remember which story I'm talking about? Aaron's sons, very good. Aaron's sons went into the Holy of Holies and they died. They experienced a spiritual overload and they died. Okay, that's what happened to Ben Azai. Ben Zoma didn't die, but he also experienced a spiritual overload and he went insane. He lost his mind. Okay. Acher, who we're going to talk about in a minute, Acher became a heretic. He left Judaism. Rabbi Akiva entered in wholeness and peace and emerged in wholeness and peace. Rabbi Akiva went in with the right perspective. Okay, he went in with when we say wholeness and peace, he went in to experience the spirituality, but to make sure that it remains grounded in this world. To experience spirituality, but to make sure that it remains grounded in this world. I saw with my own eyes a great tzaddik, a great holy rabbi, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, preparing himself to teach esoteric, mystical teachings of Judaism. And he wrapped a handkerchief around his hand. He did this discreetly, but this was the custom among the great rabbis, the great tzaddikim. When they would teach the very, very sacred teachings, they would hold on to something physical. Now, I don't understand exactly what's happening in the spiritual worlds, etc., but I saw this with my own eyes, okay? But it's over here, it's more than just holding on to a handkerchief, it's a mindset. The mindset was, I'm going to experience the spiritual, but it's about remaining grounded in this world. It's about taking those spiritual ideals and bringing them back into this world. That's the idea of wholeness and peace. Rabbi Akiva went in and he was able to come out. What do we see from the story? Bottom line, tread carefully, right? Approach with caution. These were not simple people. These were great, great rabbis, great sages, holy people. And this is what happened to them. The Talmud tells us this story because it's a warning sign. You have to be careful. Now, I do want to just take a minute and talk a little bit about this person named Acher, because he was mentioned without a name, and it's a very, very tragic but fascinating story. Acher, as I said, was a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. He witnessed the terrible persecution of the Jews under the Romans after the destruction of the Second Temple. He witnessed terrible, terrible atrocities, terrible tragedies, and that's part of what pushed him over the edge in terms of his faith. Okay, Acher, originally his name was Elisha ben Avuya, and he was a very, very great rabbi. He was a great sage. He was the teacher, the primary teacher of Rabbi Meir. You may recall when we studied about the Talmud, Rabbi Meir is the author of 80% of the Mishnah. His name is never mentioned because we have a rule, Stam Mishnah Rameir. A Mishnah without a name is Rabbi Meir, right? Meaning, if you have a person who authors a book, it doesn't say on every page, so-and-so wrote. He's the author, right? If he's quoting somebody else, if you have a forward from Dr. So-and-so, then you say forward from so-and-so. If you have an afterword at the end from another person, but the book, the entire book is his. Rabbi Meir is the author of the Mishnah. He is the primary teacher of Torah, of Talmud, of Judaism. Who was his teacher? Elisha ben Avuya. An incredible, incredible person. Elisha ben Avuya witnessed these terrible tragedies, and it started pushing him a little bit. He was having a hard time with his faith. He was having a hard time with his Judaism. He was struggling. And then he decided to go on a spiritual trip. He thought, maybe I'll go into the orchard, I'll study Kabbalah, I'll study the mystical teachings, and I'll be brought back to my faith. And just the opposite happened. He saw things that he couldn't understand, that he couldn't comprehend, that he couldn't grasp, and it sent him over the edge, and he became a heretic. He became a rebel against Judaism. The story continues. The following Yom Kippur, he came riding on a horse, which is forbidden. He came riding on a horse to the temple. All the Jews are gathered outside the temple, and they're all waiting to see the high priest come out of the Holy of Holies on the holy day of Yom Kippur, and a voice calls forth, a heavenly voice calls forth from the temple, and it says, "Return, my children, return, shuvu banim shevavim, chutz me acher," except for Acher. Instead of calling him Elisha ben Avuya, it calls him the other. The other. Now, he was pretty sure the voice was talking about him, but he wasn't 100% sure. He needed confirmation. So the story continues. The following Shabbat, this Shabbat after Yom Kippur, he goes and hires a harlot. He hires a prostitute. She recognizes him, and she says, "Excuse me? What are you doing here? Aren't you the great sage, Elisha ben Avuya?" And in front of her, he does something to violate Shabbat. And she says, "Oh, you're no longer Elisha ben Avuya. You are Acher. You are somebody else. You've become someone else." And this is when he got his confirmation that the heavenly voice was talking about him. "Return, my children, except for Acher." And he completely left everything behind, and the Talmud lists, he basically committed every sin in the book, okay? Now, interestingly enough, his student, Rabbi Meir, refused to give up on him and continued to study from him.
Wow.
And the story goes like this, that it was one Shabbos, and he was riding on a horse, which is a violation of Shabbos. Rabbi Meir is walking behind him, walking next to him, okay, and listening to him teach Torah. He was a brilliant person. He was expounding upon the Torah. And Acher, the teacher, says to Rabbi Meir, "You have to turn back now, because we've come to the 2,000 cubit boundary where the Torah says you're not allowed to leave more than 2,000 cubits outside of the city. I've been counting the paces of the horse. You have to turn back. It's time for you to return," he says to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says to him, "My teacher, it's time for you to return as well." And he says, "Well, I would love to, but the heavenly voice said that I am excluded from the opportunity to return." And it was a very tragic thing. And he died a sinner. And it says that Rabbi Meir, who was a great tzaddik, a great righteous person, understood that in the heavens, he wasn't being allowed to enter, forget about heaven. He wasn't allowed into hell. He wasn't allowed into Gehenna. Gehenna is a purification process where you can eventually be purified. They weren't allowing him into the worst place, And Rabbi Meir prayed that his teacher be entered into Gehenna, be entered into the place of punishment, so that eventually he could be purified and be entered into the holy space. Now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe once asked the question, our Rebbe in our generation asked the question, how could it be that there was a heavenly voice that said, everyone can return except for so-and-so? Don't we have a rule that tshuva, that repentance is always possible? What happened over here? And the Rebbe explained like this, and this is such a powerful message to every single person. The Rebbe said, the heavenly voice did not say everyone can return except for Elisha. It said except for Acher, the other. It was basically the heavenly voice was saying to Acher, to this person, and to his associates, if you see yourself as Elisha, if you see yourself as your core, as your soul, as your Jewish heritage, as your spiritual potential, then of course you can return. But if you've given up on yourself, if you've taken on the identity of an other, I'm no longer part of this nation, I'm no longer part of this people, I'm no longer one of God's children, and that's the way others see me as well, then the gates of repentance will be closed to you, because you will never actually make the steps to enter that gate. And of course, the message is, both to ourselves and the way we see others, to never ever give up. Never misidentify yourself as an other, as not belonging, no matter what a person does, no matter how wayward a person is, no matter how distant a person is. This doesn't mean that we're absolved of the things that we do. This doesn't mean that we don't have to take responsibility for our mistakes, but it's never too late. And as long as we believe in ourselves and we believe in those that we're trying to strengthen, we truly believe in them, and we don't say, this is an other, this is an acher, I've given up on them, they don't belong in the community, they don't belong, they're not part of our family anymore, right? As long as you don't give up on them, then the heavenly voice has not given up on them. But if you give up on them, if you give up on yourself, then the doors are closed. Right? So it's a very, very powerful and important message. Getting back to our story. So what do we see from the story? We see that there was a concern with regards to these esoteric mystical teachings of how they could be misunderstood. Now, in terms of being misused, there are many instances of people who used mystical, esoteric teachings to accomplish incredible things in the world. Okay, there's many, many stories, great Kabbalists, great rabbis and scholars and so on and so forth. I'm going to share with you, and again, I apologize to those who were in Shul this past Shabbos. I told the story in Shul, but I'm going to share with you an example of how it can be misused. And that was another reason why the teachings of Kabbalah were kept secret. Again, I'll do this very quickly because I told the story in Shul this past Shabbos. We read the famous story that the Jewish people sinned with the golden calf. 40 days after receiving the Ten Commandments say, do not make a graven image. The Jewish people created an idol, a golden calf. Who helped them create the golden calf? Aaron. Moses turns to Aaron and say, what on earth happened over here? And Aaron says, listen, my plan was to collect all their jewelry, that would take time, and to melt it down in a pot, and that would take time, and then to bring in the sculptors and start fashioning it. I figured I'd buy myself a couple of days, and you would already come back, and everything would be resolved. He says, I threw the gold into the pot, and out popped a miraculous golden calf. A golden calf came popping out. Some golden calf came flying out. How did this happen? I don't know. It was a miracle. A miracle? A miracle for such a terrible thing? The answer is yes. What happened? What happened? A few weeks earlier, the Jews were leaving Egypt, and Moses had a very important mission. The Jewish people had promised Joseph 200 years earlier, when the Jews left Egypt, that although he would be buried temporarily in Egypt, that they would bring his coffin with them to the land of Israel and bury him in the holy city of Shechem, where he is buried today, where, by the way, Jews today were given the opportunity to visit the holy city of Shechem. The IDF accompanied people, and they were able to visit the tomb of Joseph. So Moses goes looking for the coffin of Joseph, and turns out the coffin of Joseph had been thrown into the Nile River. The Egyptians were blessed by the Nile River. Joseph was a holy man. They took his coffin and threw it into the Nile River. How are you going to find a coffin in the Nile River? So Moses was a Kabbalist. He was a mystical, holy person. He took a piece of clay And with mystical energy, he wrote on the piece of clay, Alei Shor, which means let the ox rise up. Joseph is compared to an ox. Every one of the tribes is compared to an animal. Joseph is compared to an ox. Let the ox rise up. He took this piece of clay, threw it into the water. Joseph's coffin comes bubbling up to the surface. The Jews take it with them, travels with them for 40 years, and they bury Joseph in the land of Israel. What did What did Moses do with the piece of clay? This holy, mystical piece of clay? Nothing. He discarded it. Somebody saw and picked it up. A big troublemaker named Dathan, a man who made a lot of trouble for the Jewish people throughout the 40 years in the desert. And Dathan takes this piece of clay. He says, this is a good item. I'm going to hold on to this. He puts it in his pocket. Dathan is there when the Jews are trying to convince Aaron to help them create an idol. And he sees what Aaron is doing. He's trying to stall for time. The gold is melted in the pot. Dathan pulls out this piece of clay. What does the piece of clay say? Let the ox rise up, throws it into the pot of gold. Boom, the golden calf comes flying out. An idol comes out. Okay, so this is an example of mystical energy being misused. Just one of many examples. So therefore, for these two reasons, specifically Kabbalah, unlike the other teachings of the Torah, there was a concern. And therefore, it was transmitted in a very, very careful fashion. The spiritual teachings can most easily be divorced from the practical side of Judaism. Meaning, you can't really teach Mishnah and Talmud and Halachah and say, but observance of Jewish law is not important. It doesn't really make sense because it's part and parcel of what you're teaching. You're teaching Mishnah, you're teaching Jewish observance. You're teaching Halachah, you're teaching Jewish law. You're teaching ethics, it's the ethics of Judaism. You teach spirituality, it can very easily be separated from the practical down to earth. Yeah, of course I'm going to feel the spiritual energy of tefillin. I'm going to feel the spiritual energy of Shabbat, but does it matter whether I actually observe the mitzvah or not? Right? The spirituality can very easily be separated, which is why we find throughout the generations and today as well, there are teachers of Kabbalah whose Judaism is not connected with an observance of practical Judaism. Now, throughout history, any great Kabbalist, and we're going to learn about a lot of them, any great Kabbalist who is accepted as a Torah true Kabbalist also learned and taught Jewish law. Okay? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Zohar, is quoted extensively in the Mishnah with practical Jewish law, right? In more modern times, Rabbi Schneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, the author of one of the codes of Jewish law, was also a great teacher of Kabbalah, right? The Maharal, the Vilna Gaon, again, if you know these names, you know what I'm talking about. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, in our times, a great teacher of Kabbalah and a great proponent of Jewish observance. These are considered Torah true Kabbalists. There are others who are teaching Kabbalah divorced from the meaning of Jewish observance. If you see that, you know to run the opposite direction because that is Kabbalah without its intended purpose. So that's maybe a message to Madonna. I don't know what she learned, what she taught. I'm sure she's a very fine person. Okay, so what we've talked about so far is why Kabbalah was kept secret for many generations. Okay, let's go into some of the history because as you're going to see, there comes a point where things begin to change. Okay, so what I want to do is, and let's do this very quickly because we're running out of time here, and I do want to try to get to everything. Let's turn to page 238, and it's actually a spread. 238 and 239 is milestones in the history of Kabbalah. I want you to notice how early we go in the earliest revelations and writings of Kabbalah. What is the earliest writing that we have of Kabbalah? In the year 422 before the Common Era, we have the vision of the chariot of Ezekiel, one of the great early prophets of Judaism. Okay? And then moving forward, you have many of the rabbis of the period of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, were also Kabbalists. Of course, we have Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it goes throughout history over here. You can look at this incredible timeline, some of the milestones in the history of Kabbalah. Okay, again, we're not going to look through all the details over here. These are fascinating timelines that you can study on your own. Turn the page. If you turn the page, it continues. This timeline continues all the way through to modern times. Okay, so you have, let's see, in my book it was a little bit different, but basically, let's see. Yeah. So you have here some of the major teachers, and you have some of the major books of the teachings of Kabbalah. Okay, so I want to just refer this to you as we go through this. Let me just point out a couple of important moments in the teachings of Kabbalah. We're gonna do our video, which is already up on the screen. I'll show it to you. It's a very, very interesting video for this week, so try to follow along. But basically, the tradition that we have is that the earliest teachings of Kabbalah actually precede the giving of the Torah. The earliest teachings of Kabbalah, there was a book known as Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, which traces itself back to the very first man and woman, to Adam and Eve. They basically wrote what they experienced in the Garden of Eden. Again, these are very deep Kabbalistic ideas. We have a book of Kabbalah that was transmitted through Abraham, through our patriarch Abraham. We have a book of Kabbalah known as Raya Mehemna, the Faithful Shepherd, which is printed together with the Zohar, but it's a separate book, which is attributed to Moses, the original faithful shepherd of the Jewish people. Okay, and then the rest of the mystical teachings were transmitted together with the rest of the Torah at Mount Sinai, part of the oral tradition, except they were transmitted in secret. During the 2nd century of the Common Era, which is when the great change takes place, and we have the writing of the oral Torah in the form of the Mishnah, around that very same time, there is a secret writing taking place of some of the basic teachings of Kabbalah, known as the Zohar. But again, it was kept under wraps, it was kept in secret. In fact, even many scholars were not aware of the Zohar. It is quoted, it is alluded to throughout the centuries. We know clearly it's a historical fact that the Zohar was written long before it was revealed in the 12th century. But that being said, starting in the 11th and 12th centuries, there is already an interest in Europe for more understanding and more teaching of Kabbalah. This is together with the interest that we discussed last week in the teachings of Jewish philosophy and Jewish ethics. Together with that came a revelation of some of the mystical teachings. And then in the 13th century, you have the famous revelation of the Zohar. Once the Zohar comes and is printed, although it's still not transmitted to everyone, but it's available to scholars, then there's an explosion of the study of Kabbalah, of the teachings of Kabbalah, and things really take a major change in the 16th century in the city of Tzfat under the very famous Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. Okay? From the Arizal, the next major milestone is the founding of the Hasidic movement and the teachings of Chassidus. I know I just gave you a lot of information. We're going to have even more coming up in our video. So please focus your attention to the screen. Let me share the sound and everything over here. Okay. There we go. Let's hide this. Close. And let's hide this. Beautiful. And let's hide this.
The Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah, formed an integral part of the Torah's transmission from its very beginnings. The earliest Kabbalistic works are attributed to Abraham, the first Jew, or even earlier to Adam, the first man. The Talmud and the Midrashim incorporate many Kabbalistic passages. These teachings, however, were the exclusive province of a small number of sages who engaged in the study of this esoteric wisdom, and even fewer who dared to disseminate it. The prophet Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot, Merkava, recorded in the book of Ezekiel, is the biblical source for many Kabbalistic principles and ideas. A number of early Kabbalistic texts were composed in Mishnaic times, in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. These texts, however, are extremely terse and mysterious, their meaning decipherable only to those who were privy to the oral tradition that accompanied them. The great Mishnaic sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught the wisdom of Kabbalah to a close circle of disciples. These discourses and discussions were recorded in the Zohar, which remains the most basic text of Kabbalah. The Zohar, however, would remain a secret text for more than 1,000 years, although snippets of it found their way into some of the Torah works composed in the interim. The first fissures in the veil of secrecy surrounding Kabbalah began to appear in the 12th century in Spain, France, Italy, and Germany, where small groups of Kabbalists and their disciples were expounding and transcribing their teachings. It was during this period that the Zohar was first published, making its hitherto hidden teachings available to those who were admitted into the secretive Kabbalistic circles. The Chasidim of Ashkenaz was a school of Jewish mystics who were active in the German Rhineland in the 12th and 13th centuries. Its leaders, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid and Rabbi Elazar Rokeach of Worms. One of the preeminent sages of Spanish Jewry, Nachmanides, authored important works in all areas of Torah, biblical commentary, Talmudic analysis, Torah law, philosophy, and ethics. Nachmanides was also a master Kabbalist who incorporated many Kabbalistic ideas into his commentary on the Torah. Rabbi Abraham Abulafia and his disciples, active in 13th century Italy, emphasized the practice of meditative Kabbalah and the attainment of mystical union with God. Other noted Kabbalists of the medieval period include the anonymous author of the foundational Kabbalistic work Ma'arechet HaElokut and Rabbi Yosef Gikatila, Rabbi Menachem Merkanti, Rabbi Meir ibn Gabbai, and Rabbi Yehuda Chayat. Despite the surge in dissemination by the medieval Kabbalists, Kabbalah was still a secret discipline, studied and taught by an exclusive circle of mystics. The next breakthrough came in the mid-16th century when Tzfat, a city in the north of the Holy Land, became a center of Jewish mystical learning. One of the early teachers of Kabbalah in Tzfat was Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, who is known as the author of the mystical poem Lecha Dodi, Come My Beloved to Meet the Bride, sung in Jewish communities on Friday evening to welcome the Shabbat. Rabbi Yosef Karo, known primarily as the author of the Shulchan Aruch Code of Jewish Law, was also an accomplished Kabbalist, who recorded his mystical visions in his Magid Mesharim. At the hub of the Tzfat mystics were two great teachers of Kabbalah, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, known as Ramak, and Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, known by the acronym Ari, the Lion. Ramak's encyclopedic Cardus Ramonim, Orchard of Pomegranates, was a first-of-its-kind, systematic explanation of the multitude of worlds, virot, and concepts that populate Kabbalistic teaching. Ari, although his sojourn in Tzfat was cut short after only 2 years when he died in a plague at the age of 38, left behind numerous disciples and a vast body of teachings. Indeed, almost all subsequent Jewish mystical learning is predicated on the Ari's teaching. Ari revolutionized the realm of Jewish mystical learning by proclaiming that the restrictions on disseminating Kabbalistic teachings applied only in earlier generations, and that in these times it is permitted and obligatory to reveal this wisdom. As a result, a number of Ari's disciples labored to record and publicize his teachings and to seed centers of Kabbalistic learning throughout the Jewish world. One of these disciples, Rabbi Israel Sarug, traveled for 20 years throughout Italy, the Balkans, Germany, Poland, Turkey, Egypt, and elsewhere to introduce the Lurianic Kabbalah. From Tzfat, the teachings of Kabbalah spread across the Jewish world. In the following generations, additional masters and schools of Kabbalistic learning developed in various Jewish communities. Maharal was a mystic and philosopher who expressed Kabbalistic ideas in philosophical terms. His teachings influenced many subsequent schools of Jewish thought. Maharal's Kabbalah appears to derive from earlier sources, as the Tzfatian Kabbalah had not yet reached Eastern Europe in his day. There is a tradition that Maharal used Kabbalistic formulae to create a golem, a humanoid, to save the Jewish community of Prague from the frequent blood libels of the time. Another influential figure in Jewish philosophy and mysticism was Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz, who served as a rabbi in numerous Jewish communities in both Europe and the Holy Land, including Dubna, Frankfurt, Prague, Jerusalem, Tzfat, and Tiberias. He's known as Shalah, after his magnum opus Shnei Luchot Habrit, 2 Tablets of the Covenant, which blends Kabbalah, Talmudic discourse, Torah law and customs, biblical commentary, and ethics. Shalah's works incorporate the teachings of Ramak and Ari and their disciples. Other 16th and 17th century Kabbalists include Rabbi Yisrael Najar of Gaza, Rabbi Menachem Azaria di Fano of Italy, and Rabbi Naftali Herz-Bachrach of Germany. Prominent 18th century Kabbalists include Ramchal, a prodigious author of Kabbalah, philosophy, ethics, and poetry, and Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar. The Gra school of Kabbalah encompasses the Kabbalistic teachings of Rabbi Eliyahu, the Gaon of Vilna, and his disciples. In Jerusalem, the Bet El School of Kabbalah was a center of mystical learning for 250 years. Its leaders included Rabbi Shalom Sharabi of Yemen and Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, the Chidah. Notwithstanding all of this activity and publications, Kabbalah remained a closed book for the great majority of Jews. The teachings remained esoteric, requiring a subtle mind and extensive knowledge and training to properly understand. As a rule, the restrictions placed on the study of Kabbalah were still widely enforced. For example, a person had to be past the age of 40 and had to be thoroughly versed in the revealed portions of the Torah, such as Talmud and Halachah, before they would be permitted to approach its hidden element. The final breakthrough, which paved the way for the realization of the Ari's declaration that the time had come for the inner soul of Torah to be revealed, came with the founding of the Hasidic movement by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov in 1734. In addition to revealing an entirely new dimension of Torah, Chasidism also popularized and made accessible the teachings of Kabbalah by explaining its ideas in ways that made them comprehensible and applicable to all.
I mean, if I can just say, these videos are really, really incredible. And by the way, they are accessible to all of you. myjli.com/Booksmart has all of our lesson videos, as well as much, much more on each of our subjects. And I strongly, strongly encourage you to take advantage, have a look. It's really, really good stuff. Just to point out a couple of interesting things, and then we'll continue. So she mentioned that that Abraham was one of the proponents of Kabbalah. And I once heard a fascinating thing. For those that are familiar with the mystical teachings of the Eastern religions, there are some striking similarities between Jewish mysticism and some of the mystical structures in the Eastern religions. And the question really is, how did they just by coincidence come up with the same thing? So one of the interesting things, one second, is it says regarding Abraham that after the passing of Sarah, Abraham remarried Hagar. He remarried the mother of Yishmael. Again, I apologize, I'm mentioning names. If you're not familiar with the biblical history, don't worry about it. But Abraham marries a woman, gives birth to 10 children. It says he gave them gifts and he sent them east. Now, what kind of gifts does Abraham give? Is it sushi? I mean, what is Abraham giving them? Abraham gave them mystical teachings, mystical secrets for life. And he sent them east. These were not Jews. They hadn't taken on the monotheistic ways of Abraham, but they were his children. And he taught them mystical teachings. And perhaps that's where some of the mystical structures in the Eastern religions are connected to the mystical teachings of Judaism. We mentioned Chassidus, and I want to spend some time talking about the teachings of Chassidus. When I say that word Chassidus, what comes to mind when you hear that word? Chabad, good. Okay, what else? The Rebbe, okay. Chassidus, a Rebbe, very good. Religious, what else? Beverly Wood. Okay. Traditional, okay. Very good. Anything else? Anything else comes to mind?
Unique clothing.
Unique clothing, okay. I'm surprised nobody said opposition. There was a big time in Jewish history where there was tremendous opposition to the Hasidic ways and to the Hasidic teachings. Are you not familiar with this? All right, so let's just leave it alone. It's fine. No, I want to get into that a little bit because I think it's important to appreciate where some of the controversy came when Chassidus initially was founded. So let's give a little bit of history here, okay? The founder of Chassidus in the early 1700s was named Rabbi Yisrael, and he was known as the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov means master of the good name. Why he was called that, I don't know. The Baal Shem Tov. He came to a Jewish world that was broken. It was broken materially, and it was broken spiritually, with a massive and dangerous schism between the majority of unlearned, simple Jews and a small minority of scholarly elite who had completely abandoned their responsibility for the unlearned. And it was a very, very painful place. It was a very painful environment for Ashkenazic Jewry. This is Europe, Ashkenazic Jewry, Poland, Ukraine. Okay? How did this happen? How did this very difficult time in history come about? Because when you appreciate how this happened, you can appreciate a little bit some of the early concerns with the Hasidic movement. Let me give you a little bit of history, okay? In the 1400s, 1300s, 1400s, there were a number of major expulsions of Jews from France, from England, from Germany, from Italy. There was a lot of anti-Semitism throughout Europe. Christian Europe, Spain for sure, but Christian Europe was not a very friendly place to Jews. And the king of Poland realized that Jews are a tremendous asset. They're hardworking, they're family-oriented, they have values, they have connections with other countries because they have fellow Jewish communities, they speak a similar language, and he invited the Jews to come live in his kingdom, in the kingdom of Poland. And there was a relatively peaceful 300 years where the Jews were at peace and prosperous in the country of Poland. In fact, in Hebrew, the word for Poland is Polin. Polin is two Hebrew words, po-lin, which means here we can relax, here we can settle, we can finally catch our breath. There was a sense that Poland was going to be a place, it's hard for us to imagine because we know what happens in Poland afterwards, but that's the way the Jews felt in the early 1600s. Now, one of the things the Jews were given the responsibility to do is when Poland conquered Ukraine, okay, the Jews were put in charge of managing the estates of the Ukrainian peasants that had been split up between the Polish nobility. Basically, a group of Polish nobles came and split up the entire Ukraine between them. They live in Poland. There's peasants who are working the farms, slave laborers essentially, and the Jews were the managers on behalf of the Polish nobility. Was this a great job? I don't know, but this is what the Jews were doing. They were working, they were managers. Of course, I'm sure they tried to treat the peasants well, etc., etc. But you could imagine there was a fair amount of animosity from the peasants to their Jewish managers. In addition, there was a religious struggle that was taking place because the Ukrainians are Greek Orthodox. I'm sorry, are of the Russian Orthodox tradition, and the Polish were Catholics. In the eyes of the Russian Orthodox tradition, Catholicism is paganism. It's heretics. So to have Polish people rule over religious Russian Orthodox was considered, look, I don't know if it's Russian, Eastern Orthodox, whatever you want to call it. This was considered unacceptable. And again, who represents the Polish nobility? Who represents the Catholics? The Jews. So there was an uprising in 1648, led by a man whose name was Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who until today is a hero in Ukraine. Okay, he led an uprising against the Polish nobility. But a major focus of his uprising was anti-Semitism. And he went from town to town, city to city throughout Ukraine, massacring hundreds of thousands of Jews, especially Jews in small shtetl. The Jews in the large cities, the Polish provided police and security. They were pretty much protected. But it was the Jews in these small villages who ended up being massacred by the hundreds of thousands. It's known as, in Hebrew, Tach V'Tat, because that's the Hebrew years, the massacres of 1648, 1649. From the destruction of the Second Temple until the Holocaust, which is two massive destructions of Judaism, this is the worst thing that happened to the Jewish people. Yes, the expulsion from Spain was terrible, but not as many Jews were murdered. They were expelled, but they weren't murdered. Here, it's hundreds of thousands of Jews are murdered in cold blood. It was a terrible, terrible devastation for the Jewish people in Ukraine, and it had a ripple effect in Poland as well. In addition, the way Jews responded, the surviving Jews left the small cities and the small villages, and they moved to the big cities, because there you were safe, but there you had no parnasa. You had a very difficult time supporting yourself because there was plenty of anti-Semitism in the big cities and very little opportunities to support yourself. And so Jews were struggling terribly, terribly. And materially, they were struggling. Spiritually, they could barely survive. So who has time to send your kids to school and to study Torah and to delve into scholarship? Only the very, very wealthy could afford to enable their children to study. And so there was a wealthy elite who were studying Everyone else was just suffering materially and spiritually. Into this scene comes further devastation. A false Messiah by the name of Shabtai Tzvi, who misuses the teachings of Kabbalah in a very charismatic way, announces that he is the Messiah, he's here to save the Jewish people, and everyone was super excited. People were selling their homes and getting ready for the Messiah to come. This was like the answer to their suffering. And then he was denounced as a false Messiah. He was given an ultimatum by the Ottoman, by the king of the Ottoman Empire: either you convert to Islam or you are going to be 6 inches shorter and 6 feet lower. And he converted to Islam, and he dashes the hopes of Jews throughout Eastern Europe. And now they are just finished. No hope, no strength, no spirituality. And there's this massive gulf that develops between the Jews who are scholarly and the Jews who are more simple. The one thing that simple Jews held on to was prayer. Although they couldn't learn, they couldn't study, but they valued a spiritual connection, a spiritual relationship to God through the ritual of prayer. What did the scholarly elite do? They de-emphasized prayer. They minimized the importance of prayer. They said study is a lot more important. They would just pray very, very briefly. There was no meaning and fervor in their prayers. And this completely destroys everyone, because the last hope that the simple Jews had was the beauty of prayer, and that was being destroyed as well. Onto this scene, the Baal Shem Tov shows up. Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, together with his students, begins to engage. He's a great scholar. His students are great scholars, and they're engaging with the masses. They're engaging with the simple Jews. They're teaching them the basics of Judaism. They're inspiring them with the beauty of prayer and a connection to God and caring for other people. One second. And this, of course, made the elite very, very upset and very nervous. And so they opposed what the Baal Shem Tov was doing. In addition, there were rabbis who were truly great people, who were sincere, who thought, here we go again. Another false Messiah. Who needs this? And they came out and they opposed him, right? This is where the early opposition to the Hasidic movement comes from. And so I think it's important to appreciate a little bit of this history. By 3-4 generations later, the opposition was gone, because the leaders of all elements of traditional Judaism realized that these are not people who are trying to destroy Judaism. They're not trying to weaken the foundations of Judaism. On the contrary, those who are inspired through these teachings of Chassidus are even more strong in their observance and more fervent in their connection to Judaism. And so the leaders of the communities, although there were still some differences in customs and maybe some minor philosophical differences, but by the mid-19th century, there is no longer any significant opposition to the teachings of Chassidus, and that's the way it continues up until today. What's happened over the last 150 years is that, in addition to there not being opposition, the ways of Chassidus, the teachings of Chassidus, the joy, the fervor, the passion, the focus on prayer and on mystical scholarship has become part of mainstream Judaism. You go to any synagogue, Hasidic, non-Hasidic, Chabad, non-Chabad, any traditional synagogue focuses on prayer and the importance of joy and the importance of caring for others, and obviously love for your fellow. These are part and parcel of what Judaism is today. And so what the Baal Shem Tov did, together with his successors, is he took something that had fallen off the wagon of Judaism, so to speak, and he brought it back on, and he reinvigorated the ways of Judaism with the teachings of Chassidus. Now, what does Chassidus do? Just one second. It takes esoteric Kabbalistic ideas, esoteric Kabbalistic teachings, takes them from the abstract and the intellectual and the esoterical, and brings them down into very practical, down-to-earth things that people can understand. And so it strips away the dangers that were inherent in the teachings of Kabbalah, because there's a tremendous emphasis on mitzvah observance, on rituals, on tradition, on prayer, together with, invigorated by, the mystical teachings of Judaism. And so the concerns of learning Kabbalah do not exist when one is learning Kabbalah through the prism of the Hasidic teachings. Yes?
You know, I was near KJ in New York, and if beginnings of the Hasidic movement is outreach to simple Jews.
Yes.
How did it evolve into sects that look inward and they're, excuse me, but very insular?
Right. It's a good question, and we could spend a lot of time going through all the different sects and the detailed history of Chassidus, and it's fascinating. It's very, very interesting. The brief answer is the experiences that these communities went through with the assimilationist movement in Europe in the 1800s and the 1900s, followed by the Holocaust and the decimation of their community, followed by the dangers of trying to live as Hasidic Jews in America with all of the assimilation of America, followed by a very, very fiery and fervent rabbi who had a certain style. That's what brought all that together. Okay, but certainly, and by the way, they do many, many acts of outreach and kindness. For example, you go to any hospital in the tri-state area where there's millions and millions of Jews. Every single hospital, any Jew who's there in any hospital gets fresh, delicious, generous, kosher cooked meals provided by whom? By the Satmar community. Bikur Chaylim in the tri-state area, which again is millions of Jews, is all provided by Satmar. So there's many, many acts of love and kindness. Dr. Selsky was in the hospital in Sloan, right? And who brought kosher food, right? I said to them, the Pinchas Selsky, Akoyin, is in the hospital, and they brought him delicious kosher food. Again, there's a lot to talk about, and Chabad has its thing with Satmar, but again, we're doing a bird's eye view over here. So let's continue. Okay. It's getting a little late. Bear with me here because I do want to try to get to the teaching as well, because I do want to do a little bit of teaching of Kabbalah and Chassidus. One more very important question. On what basis did the status change? You may have noticed in the video, right? She said that the Arizal in Sfat already said, mitzvah legal is chachma, it's time to reveal and to teach the Kabbalistic teachings. What happened to all the dangers? What happened to all the fears? What happened to all the concerns? Okay, and certainly with the Hasidic teachings, on what basis are we suddenly letting down our guard and disseminating these teachings to the masses? Okay, and it's an important question. Okay, so first of all, it's important for us to realize that we've been discussing for 5 weeks already that Judaism evolved more and more and more and became more and more accessible in all areas. Right? The Mishnah was very cryptic originally, was elaborated upon with the Talmud, furthermore with the teachings of Halachah, right? So Judaism in general has become more accessible over the centuries. That's answer number one. But answer number two, I think, is much more important. There was a tremendous need. And based on the need, sometimes you have to, so to speak, take the plunge despite the dangers. I'm not saying bend the rules. Take the plunge despite the dangers. A famous example that's given to defend the dissemination of the mystical teachings. Famous example that was given by the Alter Rebbe himself, by the first Chabad Rebbe. He gave a famous example, a famous mashal of a king. And the king had an only son who was the heir to the throne. And this only son is deathly ill. And they've tried all treatments and nothing is working, and the son is dying. And a doctor comes along and says, the crown jewel of your kingdom, that beautiful crown jewel, that is the center of your kingdom, that is the symbol of your kingdom, has a medicinal property, has a chemical that will heal your son. You have to take that crown jewel, grind it up into a powder, mix it into water, feed it to your son, and he's going to survive. And the king said, I can't. That's my crown jewel. And he hesitated for a couple of weeks. And finally, a friend of his said, what's the point of having a crown jewel if there's no one to take over the throne? And finally, he was convinced. And he takes the crown jewel, grinds it up into powder. At this point, the son was so sick, he couldn't even swallow anything. And so you could imagine the emotions. They're taking this cup that contains the powder of the crown jewels. They're pouring it onto his mouth. Most of it is falling onto the floor. People are crying, wailing at the disrespect, at the waste, at the destruction that's happening over here. But a little drop gets into his mouth and saves his life. In a similar sense, the esoteric teachings of Judaism, the mystical teachings, are the crown jewel of God's Torah. And God says, let it be ground up, let it be disseminated in order to keep my children going through this very difficult exile. Okay? I like to give another another example of an actual story that I heard. I think it really illustrates this point in a very, very powerful way. A true story. There was a very, very great rabbi and his wife who were incredibly pious. And, it's the nature of pious people that they don't walk around necessarily hand in hand all over each other. They were very pious people, So their children had never seen open expressions of affection between them. But they were a very loving couple, right? They have a couple of children. Rabbi and his wife pass away, and the children get into a big fight. I don't know what they're fighting over, but it's terrible. They're literally killing each other, as is wont to happen sometimes in families. And a friend of the family is sitting with them, and this friend of the family says, do you have any idea how in love your parents were? How much they loved each other, how much they cherished each other, how romantic they were. And the children say, are you crazy? We knew our parents. That wasn't their thing. And the friend says, listen, I knew your parents in a way that you weren't aware. I'm telling you, they were madly in love. Here's what I want you to do. Among your parents' belongings, there's a shoebox that nobody's opened out of respect for the parents. It contains the love letters between husband and wife. And the children say, we can't open that, it's private. Open it. Read it. Read it. The children open it. They read these letters, very personal, intimate expressions of love between husband and wife. And they realize how much love and caring there was between their parents, and it brings the family back together. True story. And I think this is an incredible illustration for the dissemination of these Kabbalistic teachings. The teachings of Kabbalah are the love letters between God and the Jewish people. In the hands of the wrong person, it can be very disrespectful. It can be very inappropriate. Imagine if a 7-year-old boy gets hold of his parents' love letters and starts reading them with his friends. It's not appropriate, right? It's not for you. But for the right purpose and the right setting, it can save the family. And that was the purpose of the dissemination of the teachings of Kabbalah during that particular difficult time of Jewish history. And that continues. It continues up until today. That's one reason why it's needed today. Another reason is, and this Lubavitcher Rebbe delves into, as a preparation for the coming of the Messianic era, for the coming of Mashiach. I have here a quote here on the screen from Maimonides. This is Maimonides, the very end of his book of Jewish law. And what does Maimonides say? What are we going to do during the Messianic era? He says, what are we going to do? There will be neither famine or war, envy or competition, for good will flow in abundance, and all the delights will be freely available as dust. So friends, no mortgages, no politics, no newspapers, no social media, because that's all about famine, war, envy, competition, right? What are we going to do? So he says the occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God. What does it mean to know God? Mystical teachings, esoteric teachings. The Jews will be great sages and know the hidden matters, grasping the knowledge of their creator according to the full extent of human potential. As Isaiah, the prophet of the redemption, states, the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the ocean bed. So what are we going to do during the Messianic era? We're going to study the most esoteric, mystical teachings of Judaism. And so they are revealed today as a preparation for the Messianic era. In fact, there's a very famous story brought down in text 4. You thought I forgot about the textbook, right? Text 4. You guys went and purchased textbooks and we're not using it, right? Text 4, page 245, a very famous story of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Baal Shem Tov says, on Rosh Hashanah of the year 1746, my soul ascended to the higher worlds. I rose level after level until I reached the chamber of Mashiach. I asked Mashiach, when will the master come? He answered, by this you will know when your teachings will become known and revealed throughout the world, and your well springs will spread to the outside. Because that is a preparation for the Messianic age, when, as Maimonides puts it, we will study the teachings of Kabbalah. Okay? I'm going to share with you now a fascinating, incredible passage of Kabbalah of the Zohar. When was the Zohar written, friends? 2nd century. 2nd century. That's 1800 years ago. Here's what the Zohar says, and I quote. It's on the internet, so it's got to be true. Let's see, 445. Here we are. Okay. The Kabbalah, the Zohar writes, and it's even translated into English. In the 600th year of the 6th millennium, the gates of wisdom above, together with the well springs of wisdom below, will open up, and the world will be prepared to usher in the 7th millennium. Let's explain what these millennium are. Right now, we're in 5783, which means we're at the end of the 6th millennium. Okay, so he says in the 600th year of the 6th millennium, which is 183 years ago, the Zohar was talking about what's going to happen in, I believe it's 1840, if I'm not mistaken. 1840 is 183 years ago. What's going to happen? There's going to be a revelation of wisdom from above, esoteric, mystical wisdom, and wisdom from below, worldly, human understanding and progress. This is symbolized by one who begins preparations for ushering in the Sabbath on the afternoon of the 6th day. According to Jewish law, we begin preparing for Sabbath a few hours before the Sabbath. In the same way, toward the end of the 6th millennium, preparations are made for entering the 7th. The hint for this, and this is a Zohar that talks about the life of Noah, in the 600th year of Noah's life, all the well springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. So the Zohar alludes to something that will happen around the year 1840, okay? Now, if you go onto Wikipedia, and Wikipedia knows everything, and you search Industrial Revolution, which we know is the precursor to all progress that we have today in this world, Industrial Revolution is from the year 1760 to 1840. Now, if you look back at your Kabbalah and Chassidus timeline, from 1760 to 1840 is essentially Baal Shem Tov and his students, his successor, the Maggid, and his students, one of whom is the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Chassidus. And in 1840, there was a big event in the world of Chassidus. It was the first major publication of a very deep and elaborate book of Chassidic teachings known as Likutei Torah. This happens in 1840. Okay, coincidence? I don't know. How did the Zohar know what it was talking about 1800 years ago? I don't know, but there was a prediction that together with a revelation and an explosion of secular wisdom in the world, of human wisdom in the world, which we are experiencing today in a much faster progressive pace than ever before, there is also an incredible revelation of spirituality and of mystical wisdom. And so for these reasons, the concerns and the restrictions on the study of these teachings were pushed aside in order to save the prince, to save the child, to bring the family back together, in my second analogy, and to prepare for that which we're going to study during the Messianic era. To conclude, and friends, we started a little bit late, so I still have 12 minutes, okay? To conclude, I wanted to share with you one more really, really incredible thing, and then we'll get to the teaching. The Talmud tells us that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, the angels were very upset. They said to God, you want to give the people the Halachah of Torah, the practical Judaism of Torah, how to do business, how to treat their parents, how to pay their employees, no problem, that's for humans. But Kabbalah, mysticism, this belongs here. And Moses had to go through a whole explanation of how Kabbalah belongs here in this world, in this lower world, not with the angels. And King David alludes to this with a very famous verse where he says, Olisa lamarein shavisa shevi. You went up to the supernal heights, Moses, and you captured a captive. You captured a captive. What is the captive? The mystical teachings of Torah. Moses grabbed it and brought it down to this world because of its tremendous power and because of how important it is. The Lubavitcher Rebbe once pointed out an interesting thing. The word Shevi, which is Shin Bet Yud, let me show this to you in my notes over here. I typed it up. Shin Bet Yud, you have captured a captive. Shin Bet Yud is the acronym for Shimon ben Yochai, the author of the Zohar. Yitzchak ben Shlomo, again, Shin Bet Yud, the Arizal of Tzfat. Yisrael ben Sarah, the founder of Chasidus, the Baal Shem Tov. And Yosef Yitzchak ben Shalom, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who started the process of worldwide translation and dissemination of mystical teachings of Judaism around the world. Just an interesting little thing over here, how you see these great leaders spelled out so powerfully and so beautifully in these ideas.
So is
Okay,
that Kabbalah? Like, I don't understand what Kabbalah even is. Like, is it because of the?
that was a little piece of Kabbalah.
How-
This is Kabbalah, by the way.
Right? In a book,
Yeah,
2,000 years ago, that in the 6th millennium and the 600th year. I can understand the 600th year from Noah.
they had a tradition.
But what made him come? to
They,
600?
this was a tradition that they had, going back to Moses. Mystical teachings. Okay, let's learn some Kabbalah and Chassidus, and then we'll conclude. Okay, friends, Passover is coming. Passover is coming. So I want to just share with you one very, very beautiful concept connected with Passover. Okay, so we have here a very cryptic, interesting teaching of the Zohar regarding Passover. Again, I'm going to read this to you. It's a little bit cryptic, but basically what we're going to see over here is that on Passover, there's a lot of spirituality happening with regards to Passover. Let's read this very quickly over here. Faithful shepherd, when the night of watchfulness, which is the Shekhinah, the divine presence, has the power over the vessels of Pesach, everybody should be guarded, kept from chametz and any kind of leaven. Every food and drink should be watched, and whoever keeps them from chametz and leaven, his body is kept from the evil inclination below, and his soul is kept from above, as it says, nor shall evil dwell within you. For his body becomes holy, and his soul the holy of holies. And it says of the evil inclination, no stranger shall eat of the holy thing, and the stranger that comes near shall be put to death. So we see somehow that chametz is something, leavened bread is something to be avoided, like the plague on Passover. Let's continue. One more thing. Again, very, very Kabbalistic. Pesach is the right arm, which is Abraham, namely chesed, kindness, refined silver. Whoever mixes lead in it is false to it. This is Zohar. Similarly, for anyone who mixes chametz or leaven at all in the matzah, it is as if he is false to the king's coin, which is malchut, called matzah. So is whoever mingles any admixture into his drop of semen by forbidden intercourse or by thinking of someone else, as if he is false to the king's seal, which is yesod, for they are interdependent. The deed below causes damage above. We could unpack this for a couple of days, okay?
Yeah.
The point that I want to focus on here is that for some reason on Passover, we have an obsession with avoiding bread. Don't eat bread. This is a really, really bad idea, okay? Now, in general, in the Haggadah, which we're going to say the night of Passover, we're going to talk about how Passover is not just a historical experience, but it's something that we say in every generation, we see ourselves as experiencing the exodus from Egypt. Egypt represents restrictions. The exodus from Egypt represents experiencing your soul's potential, experiencing freedom. Okay? What is the first step in experiencing the freedom of your soul, experiencing true freedom? Avoiding bread, avoiding chametz, and eating matzah. By the way, chametz and matzah are almost the exact same thing. They're both bread and water. Bread and water is chametz. Wheat and water. Flour and water is chametz. Flour and water is matzah. What's the difference? There's a scientific process called leavening, which begins when you mix when you mix flour with water. Forget about the yeast. That's just an extra thing if you want to have really fluffy dough. Even without the yeast, it will eventually begin to rise. It becomes leavened bread. What's happening when it's rising? It's becoming all puffy, filled with air. That's the only difference between chametz and matzah. Whether the fermentation process takes place, okay? And yet we have this incredible obsession with avoiding anything that would be even a whiff or a hint of chametz in our homes. And Jews have done this throughout the generations. There's a famous story. The Berditchever Rebbe was sitting, this is in the 1700s, a contemporary of the Alter Rebbe, of Rabbi Schneur Zalman, is sitting in Berditchev, and he always tried to find ways to show God the beauty and the virtues of the Jewish people. During this time, there was a power struggle. There was a war between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and the Russians had banned any Turkish goods. Turkish goods were banned by penalty of death. So they're sitting the last day of Passover. He's sitting with his students, and he says to his students, "Can someone bring me some Turkish tobacco?" Turkish tobacco apparently was like, Cuban cigars, right? But in Russia, unlike the Cuban cigars, which you could sneak into America, in Russia, if you were caught with Turkish tobacco, it was off with your head, okay? And they said to him, "Rebbe, it's illegal." He says, "Yeah, I know it's illegal, but if you can get me some, I'd appreciate it." Within 10 minutes, he slipped under the table a little package of Turkish tobacco. Then he says, "Can someone bring me some chametz? Can someone bring me some bread?" They say to him, "Rebbe, it's Passover. Nobody has bread." He says, I know bread is forbidden, but if you can get me some, I'd appreciate it." They come back and they say, "Rebbe, we searched everywhere. Nobody has bread. It's Passover." He turns to God and he says, "God, it's incredible. It's incredible. The Tsar has policemen on every corner, ready to execute people for owning Turkish tobacco. And yet in 10 minutes, I had it. The Jews haven't seen you or any of your guards since Mount Sinai. And yet we listen to you. And we follow your laws. We follow your decrees. Look how virtuous the Jewish people are. But why are we so obsessed? What's the issue? Why is chametz? You see the way the Zohar describes it, the evil inclination. It's so terrible. Stay away from it. What's wrong with it? Okay. So this is a very famous Kabbalistic teaching as it is explained, as it's elucidated through the teachings of the Zohar. Let me bring it up over here. This little thing over here is getting in my way. 1 second. Out. Done. Here we are. Okay. So this is how you spell chametz and matzah in Hebrew. Again, for those of you that are familiar with the Hebrew letters, the mem and the tzaddik, mem, tzaddik, same letter. I know here it's a final tzaddik. It looks different, but trust me, it's the same letter. Okay? Mem, tzaddik, mem, tzaddik. Chametz, leavened bread, matzah, they share 2 of 3 of the same letters. Even the 2 letters that are different look the same. Hey and chet look the same. They both have 3 lines. It's like an upside down U with an opening on the bottom. What's the difference? The hey has a little escape valve right over here. Otherwise, it's the same thing. What does this symbolize? So the Kabbalists explained to us like this, that the difference physically, scientifically between bread and matzah is that matzah is flat. It has no air. Remember, they use that thing with the holes. If you come to the matzah bakery that we're having here on Sunday, we give it holes so that when you bake it, doesn't get puffed up. It stays flat, okay? And the bread gets all puffed up, gets filled up with hot air. Bread, chametz, symbolizes the ego. Matzah symbolizes humility, a person who's humble. Okay? What's going on over here? Every human being has an opening below. An opening below means has the potential, because we're human, we make mistakes. We do stupid things. We say regrettable things. We hurt other people. We have moral failures. It happens. We're human. We're not perfect, right? A tzaddik is a righteous person is symbolized by closed on 4 sides. No evil can come in. Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. A regular person has an opening. Negativity can come from below, from unhealthy places. The difference is if you're filled with an ego, the negativity comes in and it has nowhere to go. A person who's arrogant, if they do something regrettable, because they're so full of themselves, they'll never own up to it. They'll never make amends. They'll never say, I'm sorry. They'll never turn to God and say, I made a mistake. Can we make this better? Because they're full of themselves. So they're stuck with the negativity and it just gets all puffed up and it fills them up. The little escape valve of the hay is humility. Yes, the evil can come in. The negativity can come in. Human reality expresses itself in our lives, but we're humble enough to recognize it and to fix it and to make it better. And when we experience humility, when we access humility in our lives, when we get rid of the chametz like the plague, we literally eradicate it, at least temporarily, as a starting point. Temporarily, for the holiday of Passover, we eradicate arrogance from our lives. We experience real humility symbolized by matzah. Then we can begin a journey of freedom. A person who's arrogant is trapped. They can't grow. They're trapped within themselves. They're trapped within their ego, and they can't experience freedom. Real freedom begins with humility, with the ability to recognize and to make amends. Okay, so this is a teaching of the Zohar as elucidated through the teachings of Chassidus into our modern lives. Again, there's many, many other examples. We could go on forever. They bring many examples here in the lesson, but we are out of time. Friends, I want to just take this opportunity. To me, this has been one of the most incredible journeys of the JLI. It's been a very, very special experience. I want to thank you all for joining and for being so consistent, coming week after week and participating and really being part of the conversation. It's been a tremendous honor. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I want to just mention, we have a really exciting course of the JLI. It's a 4-week course starting after Passover. I believe the start date is April 26th. A few things. First of all, if you sign up by April 1st, there is a 20% discount. You can actually fill out this paper and sign up tonight. Second of all, every night of this 4-week course, we're going to have a gourmet dinner. So don't cook. Come enjoy sushi, roast beef, all kinds of good things every night. It's going to be a wonderful experience. Bring some friends. Let's make it a party. It's going to be same time. It's going to be a really, really incredible course. Some very, very interesting. This course is going to be out of this world. We're going to talk about the supernatural, demons, dreams, astrology, angels, spirits, Chinese balloons, everything. We're going to get into it from a Torah perspective. Please join us. If I don't see you before Passover, have a wonderful Passover. Enjoy the freedom that comes through the study of our Torah. Thank you. Have a wonderful Passover.